Kia ora, hello and Guten Tag. Welcome to Berlin Wall Stories, an exhibition that was commissioned by the German Embassy in Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It explores the perspectives of 10 unique people and their relationship with the Berlin Wall, a concrete wall that once divided East and West Berlin, and the border strip that ran between the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. You're about to hear a recorded interview with one of our participants who shared their personal Mauergeschichte, their Berlin Wall story. Enjoy and viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
My relationship with the wall itself didn't start until I went to Berlin for that first time. However, I think what is interesting, and I'm still working through this, I suppose, over the years, is that right from when I was a small child, there was this curiosity about Germany in particular. Britain also, because I believe that my parents are both originally descended from Britain. My mother was born in Fiji into a very British colonial society, and I identified with her and not with my father, who was away playing golf all the time. So I thought of myself as some kind of Brit on the other side of the world. But also, because I'm as old as I am now, when I was a kid, we didn't have any New Zealand books or comics or anything like that. And so all our books and comics in particular came from Britain. And my favorite comics, they were not just cartoons of the Disney style, they were much more substantial, but they involved a lot of stories of World War II, the British focus on winning the war. There were a lot of stories of British heroes and of the German villains. And then as a child starting school, or in my early years of school and primary school, we lived in a small village south of Auckland. And while we lived there, next door was the sports domain, and they built a new entrance with big gates and pillars on either side. And on one pillar was that was a list of names of the local men who had died in World War I, and on the other pillar, a list of the local men who had died in World War II. And so I would come out of my house and walk past this every day, going to and from school. So that consciousness was in me from a very young age. So that sets up a preconception that you're not even conscious of. What struck me when I first visited Europe was that traveling around the various countries, the people that I would meet who were friendly and who were interested in getting to know me, for some reason, they were all German. The French, the Italians, the Greeks, the British, the Scandinavians, I didn't find myself making friends with any of them, whereas I was regularly making friends with German people. And then in Greece, I had an accident. I fell off a motorcycle. And on my way back to Britain for medical treatment, I met a woman from Bavaria who helped me with getting onto the ferries and things like that. And she invited me to Germany. And so that began a more intimate connection, if you like. But I had a friend, a New Zealand friend, living in Berlin. He'd been there 2 years, and he'd invited me to visit him in Berlin. So eventually, when I only had a short time left before I had to return to New Zealand, I went up to Berlin, but only for 3 days. And my friend Martin, he spent the whole 3 days moaning that I was only there for such a short time. But of course, I wanted to be with my new girlfriend in Regensburg. But those 3 days were the 7th, 8th, 9th of November. And on the first evening that we were there, he took me onto the S-Bahn and we rode it over the wall into Friedrichstrasse station. Now, we didn't get out. We just sat there and waited, and then the train took us back into West Berlin. But that immediately, the effect of the wall was instant. Physically riding over the wall and seeing the contrast, the lack of electricity in the east, the people on the train, Martin pointing out to me how nobody spoke in a normal voice, they all whispered. And he later explained to me how that was because you might not be saying anything against the regime, but you might be misinterpreted as thinking or saying things against the regime. And so people would always speak in very hushed tones. So the impact of the wall, hit me as soon as I arrived in Berlin. And then, of course, on the third day was when I went to visit East Berlin and found out a whole lot more.
And how was that for you to be in East Berlin?
It was like stepping back in time. I know that's a bit of a cliche, but that is exactly how it felt. The idea was that I would go over in the morning and spend the day exploring. And then in the evening, Martin, when he finished his job as an English teacher, would come over and join me, and we would have dinner together in a restaurant where a former girlfriend of his, well, he was still involved to some extent, had been working as a waitress, is where he'd met her. And he'd been conducting this affair with this woman who turned out to be married with a couple of kids on the 24-hour visas that, that foreigners were able to get to go and visit East Berlin. And he has a whole lot of stories about those experiences being tracked by the Stasi and so forth, which were going to be part of my Berlin film, but that's another story why that didn't happen. But yeah, so I went over at about 10 in the morning. It was a weird experience. Martin told me to go through Checkpoint Charlie because that way you went through the physical gap in the wall and you could see the checkpoint, as opposed to going on the train through Friedrichstrasse. You were just in an enclosed building all the time. It didn't have the same feeling about it. And of course, Checkpoint Charlie is famous for being the military access, of all the checkpoints between West and East Berlin. Yeah, so when I went through that morning, you walk through the gap in the wall, you walk up about 50 meters, you go around a guard tower, and then up a diagonal path into the passport control building. There's a big waiting room. There's a corridor where halfway down the corridor, there's a young man behind a perspex glass who stares at your passport for a full 10 seconds and then stares at your face for a full 10 seconds and then repeats that procedure another 3 times before letting you go through into the other waiting room on the other side of that corridor. That waiting room was totally empty, except for surveillance cameras in the ceiling, no furniture, no nothing. And then from there, you go into the baggage check area where you turn out your pockets, they take your camera apart, you pay the 25 West marks that get converted to East marks that you then can't change back again. And while I was having my bags checked, a woman came through who was a journalist, and she whispered in my ear while we were waiting. The staff behind the counter, they were stalling and wandering around and doing nothing, just deliberately making you wait for no reason at all and letting you know that they were doing it for no reason at all other than to annoy you. Um, but this woman whispered in my ear, "The women are the worst." Um, I don't know what made her say that, but it stayed with me. Anyway, then I was let through out into East Berlin, and I spent the day exploring. And as I say, it was really was like stepping back in time. Um, Shop windows. I have a strong image of two shop windows either side of a door with a triangular pile of tins, and every tin was the same. It was the one product. And I remember another shop window with a TV set in it, but the TV set was the same kind that my parents bought in 1959, 30 years earlier, or very similar in look. So it really was like stepping back in time, 30 years or so. Um, but yes, I wandered all over the city, um, taking lots of photographs. Um, and then in the evening, I met up with Martin at the outside the Friedrichstrasse station. Um, for some reason, and I'm a bit confused by this still, he seemed to not be able to remember his way to the restaurant or where it was. Maybe it was just a time thing. So at one point, we encountered a young man. I think Martin stopped him, or maybe he approached us. I can't remember exactly for sure. But this guy not only told Martin where the restaurant was, but offered to guide us there. And then Martin invited him to join us for dinner. So we had this three-way conversation, but of course I didn't speak a word of German at that point. So I didn't really know what was going on. But what I could see was that Martin's jaw was dropping as this guy was talking. And everybody else in the restaurant was talking in the way that we'd observed on the train 2 nights earlier, very quietly. Whereas this guy was speaking quite loudly, and he was talking about things like the protests that had been happening in East Berlin and Leipzig over the previous weeks. And Martin couldn't believe, A, that he was talking about such stuff, and B, that he was talking about it so loudly. Anyway, by the end of our meal, the young man had told us that he would love to take us for a ride in his Trabi, but he couldn't that night because he'd had a beer with us. And East Germany had a 0 alcohol level for driving. And as we left the restaurant, this young man just suddenly said, "Sorry, I must rush. I have to make a phone call." And Martin turned to me and said, "Oh, he's off to report to his Stasi boss." And I thought, you're joking. And then I realized Martin wasn't joking. He was quite certain that we'd been accompanied with our meal by a Stasi spy, if you like. So so after that we walked back down to return to West Berlin. It's about 9:30, 10 o'clock by this time in the evening. Martin had come through Friedrichstrasse because it was much quicker that way. And so you had to go back the way you came. So we parted. He caught the train. And I walked down the kilometre or so to Checkpoint Charlie. And that's where things started getting really weird.
So that was the night where, Günter Schabowski read out his very memorable quote of telling everyone that they are allowed to leave. Yeah. So by this time, you sat in a restaurant while he was reading this.
Exactly. It would have been going on at the same time. As I was coming down Friedrichstrasse, towards the checkpoint, the people started walking past me very fast, and in some cases jogging, which was really weird because, in line with everything else I was saying, you didn't run in East Berlin, it seems. That was in itself would be suspicious. At least that was the sense I had. So it was really surprising that people were running past me towards the checkpoint. And when I got to the checkpoint, there was a crowd around the door of people all trying to get through, get in, but they weren't being allowed in. But the guard at the door, when I pulled out my foreign passport, my New Zealand passport, and held it up so that he could see it, he let me through. And the whole interior of the checkpoint was jammed full of people. But I managed to sort of squeeze my way through to the baggage area, where they weren't bothering to check the bags at all. While I was trying to get from there through into the waiting room, a TV camera man and a reporter came up behind me, and the cameraman pointed the camera at the guards behind the baggage check, and the look that guard gave him was so disturbing, so frightening. The guy dropped the camera immediately. But the journalist said, please let us through. We have to film these people. That in itself was strange. This, of course, this was in English, that I understood. So anyway, then I got through. They got through ahead of me. I got through into the waiting room, which, as I described earlier, had been totally empty earlier in the day, and it was jammed full of people, shoulder to shoulder. I think there must have been at least 200, maybe 300 people jammed into that room. And they were all jabbering away excitedly, and I couldn't understand a word. But I seemed to be the only foreigner. That in itself was weird. Checkpoint Charlie was a foreigners' checkpoint, not a locals. Not one for the workers going back and forth between East Berlin and West Berlin daily, as they used to do. Most of them supposedly spies of one form or another, so they say. Anyway, I was in the room for about what seemed like about 10 minutes, and then one of the officers got up on a chair and spoke to the crowd, and they all en masse turned and went back out into the east. And so I was left alone in this room, surrounded by 10 or 12 East German shoot-to-kill border guards. I'm thinking, what is going on? What do I do? So I approached the nearest one and said, "Excuse me, do you Entschuldigung bitte, sprechen Sie English bitte?" About as much German as I knew at that point. And he said to me, "Ja." And so I said, "Can you tell me what's going on, please?" And he said, "Would you mind to wait 1 minute? You can sit." And he pointed and led me to this one chair, that the only chair in the room that hadn't been there earlier in the day. And so I thought, well, I think I'd better sit. So I sat and I waited, and then about another 5 minutes later, another of the officers came over and took me by the elbow and led me to the electronic door, and opened the door for me. And then I went into the passport control corridor, and exactly the same as earlier in the day, the 10-second stares repeated time after time, four times the cycle. And then out into the other waiting room on the other side of that corridor. And it was totally empty. But as I was halfway down that room, I heard the door clang behind me, and I turned to see two young women, and they were literally in the air jumping with joy. So I stopped, and they came up to me. They spoke a little English, and they explained to me that they were being allowed through because they'd been previously granted visas a week or two earlier to visit relatives in the West, but that everybody else had been told to go home. So the three of us, were talking. We went out the door, and then the path went off at a 45-degree angle towards the last guard tower where the big gates were for the checkpoint, where traffic could go through. And then you went around this little guard tower and through a little gate there. And the footpath, there was another 50 meters down to the actual gap in the wall. You can see that in the photos that I've sent you. And as we rounded that guard tower and went through that gate, looking ahead of us, that 50 meters, we could see this huge crowd in the gap in the wall. And as we walked towards them, people started whistling and cheering and clapping. And lights came on, which I realized later were television cameras. And all I could think at that moment was, I don't know what's going on here, but somehow this is about them, not me. And I held back. I stepped behind the two women and let them go in front of me, down to the crowd. Well, they got swamped by journalists. And so I just moved off to the side. And again, you can see in one of the photos I took of the checkpoint earlier in the day, there was a little ledge which I stepped up onto, and I pulled out my camera and took a photo of the crowd.
Yeah.
Now,
where you can see the cameraman right in the front, right?
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. And it was at that moment that I realized that I only had one more frame after that left on my film.
Oh, no.
I'd used up all my other films in the East. So anyway, seeing that cameraman, he had a logo on his camera that looked like the logo of a television network in Australia that I'd worked with. So this is in my days working in drama, not documentary. Mm-hmm. So seeing this logo, I thought, well, he probably speaks English then. So I made my way through to him and I asked him what was going on. And he told me how they'd heard on the BBC World Service that the East Berlin government had said they were going to open the border. And so they'd rushed down straight away to see if anything was happening. Mm. And I said, well, did anybody else come through before me and the two women? And he said, no, you were the first.
So a Kiwi and two Eastern German girls were the first to walk through Checkpoint Charlie after that's a beautiful story, Tony.
Thank you.
That's just amazing.
It is astounding.
Like as a Kiwi walking through that gate through that. It's amazing.
Yes, it is. And to this day, I still marvel at the pure chance of that happening. I used to be quite religious when I was younger for a while. I suppose I still have a sense of spirituality of a kind, certainly not conventional. But if there is such a thing as fate, then why was I there? Why was it? Why did it happen to me and not to some other person from some other part of the world? Why any other person from another part of the world at all? I still find myself wondering about that.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely beautiful. I have no words for that, and I feel like I was just hesitant to say that, but I feel like it's a bit of destiny as well to be there at the right time, the right place. And even though you haven't really researched the history so much before you came there, but obviously it kind of overran you as a big wave of empathy and just to get that feeling between East and West, and also between people that had the chance to be reunited on that very evening, which is amazing for me.
Oh yes, I mean the emotion in the crowd. Both. I mean, even before I knew what was going on, but especially once I did know what was going on, you couldn't help but be swept up by that emotion. So that you see that even 20 years later, when I made that Berlin film, that I would get emotional talking about it.
Yeah. So can you describe that a bit more for me? So how, for people who don't know much about that history, or that particular day, how did it feel like to see the crowd cheering and clapping? I'm just interested in how you received that on that very evening, to see those people from East and West to be reunited.
No, that's an interesting question, and it's in some ways quite a difficult one to answer, because at that point I didn't know much about the history. Um, I knew that the wall had been put up 28 years earlier. The different attitudes that people had, that the East German government, viewed it as a protection against invasion by fascism, by imperialism, and so forth. Um, that the West regarded it as an attempt to stop people leaving the East, and of course we know that there's truth in that. That all the youngest and brightest, the most capable, the most adventurous, the most innovative people were the ones who were leaving for the West in droves between the end of World War II and the erection of the wall. Um, but on the night, though, I didn't know that much about the history and what it was really like to live in the former East. That was a process that happened over the following years, and especially when 20 years later I started to make the documentary. Um, on the night itself, all I could really sense was this extraordinary joy and happiness, this sense of celebration. Um, I stayed around the checkpoint for till about 3 a.m. And the crowd wasn't going anywhere. Um, it was midnight when exactly midnight when the checkpoint opened and people were allowed to flow through freely. Um, and I remember the crowd making a corridor for cars, trabis mainly, to come through. And every person that came through, whether in a car or as a pedestrian, they were greeted warmly. The crowd would give them beers or whatever. There were lovely moments like the one outside the cafe window where a woman from West Berlin and a guy from the East met, and they clearly hadn't seen each other for a long time, and they hugged. I saw them come together. He came from the checkpoint, and she came. She had come, up Friedrichstrasse on the west side. So yes, I saw them come together and hug. I don't think I really comprehended the real significance in a global sense at that point. Um, I was just in awe of what was actually happening in front of my eyes, and excited by it. Took me a long time to persuade somebody, to find somebody who was willing to give me a spare roll of film so that I could take those photos. As I said, I'd only had one frame left after I took that photo of the crowd when I first came through. What I did do was, while I was trying to find rolls of film and not having any luck, I found a phone box around the corner. And so I phoned Martin's flat, thinking that he wouldn't be home yet because he would be caught up at the other checkpoint and something going on like that. But his flatmates might be able to tell me where I could buy a roll of film at that time of night. It was how desperate I was to get one. But Martin answered the phone, which really shocked me. And I said, "What are you doing at home? Aren't you caught up in the crowds at the checkpoints?" And he said, "No. What are you talking about?" And I said, "Martin, there's this huge crowd at Checkpoint Charlie because the East Germans have said they're going to open the border." This was before midnight, before the crowds had started coming through. Um, and he didn't believe me. So I said, "Look, honestly, it's true," and went on. He said, "Just a minute." And he grabbed the radio and turned on the BBC World Service. And I heard through the phone line the BBC World newsreader announcing that the East Germans had said they were going to open the border. So I said, "See, Martin, it's true. It's true. Come out. Come and join me. It's so exciting down here." And he said, "Oh no, I'm a bit tired. I'm just going to go to bed. You come home when you're ready, and yeah, I'll see you then." And of course, I was booked on a train at 6 a.m. to go back to Bavaria for my last 2 or 3 days with my girlfriend before having to fly back to New Zealand. So, so Martin went to bed and didn't experience any of it all. But of course, the sad thing about that, about the fall of the wall, I talk about a different perspective. Once the wall had fallen, his East German girlfriend was no longer interested in him because he was no longer exotic. She could wander around the West as much as she liked. So for him, the fall of the wall was the loss of what I would say was the love of his life. You know, he was obsessed with her.
Oh,
You know, he was in love with her for sure.
oh, that's disappointing. Yeah. Okay. But probably, yeah, there were many relationships like that, I suppose.
I dare say.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. So you managed to get another role for your camera.
Yes.
By from someone who was able to sell you one or to give you one.
Yes, I went through the crowd, having failed through the phone call to find anything, find out where I could get one. I just went through the crowd. I just asked everybody who had a camera, "Do you have a spare roll?" And eventually, a guy who had climbed a scaffolding pole tossed me down a roll, and I tried to give him 10 Deutschmark, and he wouldn't take it. So, so I had one roll of 36 frames, which I used up. Yeah.
Okay. And the Australian cameraman was not interested in interviewing you that night?
No, he wasn't.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't East German.
I suppose. It's always the thing with such events, isn't it? Like there's so many things happening all at once, and you try and get your head around while you're working and being excited at the same time. I suppose. Yeah. So, oh, what an incredible story! I just wrote down a few questions. I didn't want to interrupt you.
Can I tell you just one or two little more incidents?
Oh, good. I was wondering that just out of interest, the 24 hours visa for foreigners. So did you just because I honestly don't know. Did you just turn up at the checkpoint with your passport and said, I want a visa? Or how does that work?
Yeah, that's exactly how it worked. You didn't have to do anything in advance. If you were a foreigner in West Berlin, you could just walk up to the checkpoint, go through the process, change the money, and go out and explore.
Wow.
Yeah. As I say, apart from the intimidatory attitude of the officials in the checkpoint, it was quite straightforward and quite easy.
All right. And was there any restriction on how often you could go over, or was that just any time you wanted?
As I understand, there was no restriction at all. You just had to be back by midnight that same day.
Yeah, sounds like pumpkin time Cinderella.
So, well, I do know that when Martin used to go and visit his girlfriend, he would often go very early in the morning and then come back just right on midnight.
Yeah, I'm very sorry that she broke his heart. But despite that, did you get into a conversation with Martin, with your friend, about what happened that night, and what significance it had?
On that actual night, what actually happened when I left the checkpoint about 3 a.m. As I was waiting at the bus stop, a guy came along with a huge armful of newspapers, and he was giving them to anybody. He wasn't taking money for them. And I tried to get one, but I failed. But I got a photograph of a young Japanese woman holding the last one she'd managed to get. And then what happened was, now her name was Mitsui, but I never got her contacts because she didn't speak English. But her companion, a French woman named Isabel, we kept in touch for some time after. And I actually visited her in Austria and in Paris. Yeah, and anyway, the three of us got on a bus, and they sat behind me, and we were talking. And then a young man sat beside me, and when the bus took off, he said something to me in German that I didn't understand. And so I said, I'm sorry, I don't speak German. And he said, in quite halting words, "It is a beautiful day." And I said, "It certainly is." And he flung his arms around me in a huge bear hug. We were total strangers. And then at one point, when the bus was somewhere near where Martin lived, we were sitting chatting. The young man got off the bus fairly soon. He'd told me that it was his first time in the West, and he had to be back at work at 6 a.m., but he was taking this opportunity to see the West for the first time. And then he got off the bus. So I carried on talking with Isabel and Mitsui, and then we realized after a while that the bus wasn't moving and had been sitting still for about 10 minutes or so. And we looked out and realized we were in the midst of a huge traffic jam. The whole of West Berlin was one big traffic jam. So we got out and walked amongst the crowd, and people were giving each other, Sekt, beers, waving flags and all sorts, cheering and whistling. This is about 4 a.m. by now. And Isabella Mitsui and I found a cafe, and we went in and decided to have a coffee. And I asked them, would I be able to get a copy of that newspaper at the train station? Because in 2 hours' time, I was off to Bavaria. And they said, "Oh, we can get another one. You have this one."
Oh, wow.
And so they gave it to me, and I still have it.
Wow, so you still have it. You should bring it with you if you like.
Yes, sure.
Wow.
I've thrown away the middle pages. I was in saving space, but I've got the front pages, which is what matters.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, my film editor decided that bit wasn't interesting enough to include in the film, and we had trouble including the whole, everything that I wanted to say in 90 minutes. I mean, I had 65 hours of footage for that film to reduce to 90 minutes, so that little bit didn't make it into the film. But I like it.
It's incredible that you, obviously had to process that whole day and even decided to make a film out of it years later. So it must have had such an impact on your life, although you are not a German, you're from New Zealand. Yeah.
Now, you've raised an interesting point there. My career has been in live theatre and in screen production, but always in drama. Directing plays, being an assistant director on film sets, and my long-term dream, which I'm still working on, is to tell dramatic stories on screen. It had never occurred to me to make a film, a documentary, even though a psychic guy had told me years earlier that one day I would be working in documentary, and I just didn't believe it. But what happened was that in 2009, at the beginning of the year, I'd got to know some people connected with the Documentary Edge Festival here through the theatre connection. Alex Lee and I were working on a theatre production together. I was mentoring a production by Asians in New Zealand, actors, directors, writers, and so forth. And through that link, I met these young German people who were working as interns for Doc Edge. And one of them, Diana Kluger, who is from Leipzig but now lives in Berlin, I remember telling her and the others this story as I've been telling you. And she looked at me as if I was weird and said, "Why haven't you made a documentary about this?" I thought,
True
"Oh,
words.
okay." And she said, you know that this year is the 20th anniversary, 2009.
Mm.
And so I thought, wow, yeah, okay. So over the next few months, I managed to get a little bit of money together, and my favorite cameraman, who's from Croatia, and so he had grown up in a communist country,
Yeah.
and had actually left Croatia to come to New Zealand at the end of the Bosnian War because, as he said, war makes you hate, and I didn't want to hate anymore.
Mm.
And so he and his wife came to New Zealand. He'd had he'd managed to avoid holding a gun, in carrying a gun in the Bosnian Wars, by being an archival cameraman, but that meant that he saw the worst.
Mm.
And one of his colleagues was shot and killed by a sniper, when they were working. So he came to New Zealand. So obviously he was the perfect guy to come with me to to shoot that film.
Mm.
And so it went from there.
Wow, wow, amazing. And if you wouldn't have shot that film, I wouldn't have come across you as well. And then that kind of brings us. I might, ask you a few more questions later on about
As many as you like.
about Berlin. Just having the time here. That brings us to New Zealand, really, because I know your film has been aired here, and one question would be, how was it received, especially by New Zealanders?
Well, I guess people who don't like it or who find it boring don't tend to say anything. It's a part of the New Zealand nature. We're very polite a lot of the time. But the enthusiasm for the film was quite extraordinary. I have to acknowledge here that it was self-funded, a certain amount of help from friends, but it cost me a lot of money to make it, and I had no money left for promotion. I didn't even have enough money to pay the festival submission fees to try to get it screened in places around the world. So it hasn't had the exposure that it should have. And that's partly my naivety and inexperience. I'm not a producer. I'm a director. I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a money person or a business person.
Sure.
So the film hasn't had the exposure it should have had internationally or even in New Zealand. But let me put it this way. We had 3 screenings in Auckland. The first, this is in the Doc Edge Festival. The first screening, of course, was sold out because of I have quite a few friends and so on. But the second screening had a big audience, and then the third screening was 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning.
Wow.
And on the Saturday, I started getting phone calls from all sorts of people pleading for a ticket.
Oh.
It was advertised as sold out, online. But even with that, there was still a big queue of people wanting to get tickets on the Sunday morning who couldn't.
Yeah.
And then in Wellington, a couple of weeks later, we had one screening on a weekday afternoon, 3:00 on a Tuesday, I think, and it was half full. And then as soon as that screening was over, bookings just flooded in. The other 2 screenings sold out. I managed to persuade them to schedule an extra screening at the only time that was available was 10 p.m. on a Sunday night, and in Wellington, public transport finishes by 11, so access was a bit difficult. And that nearly sold out.
Mm.
But I remember with that screening, it was supposed to start at 9:45, I think, but I was told beforehand that in another film that was screening in the other cinema, this is at the Roxy in Wellington, I don't know if you know it, but
Yeah.
a wonderful place.
Yeah.
Um, in the other cinema, another film was screening, but there was a guy who was blind who wanted to come to my film, but the films were going to overlap a bit. And so the organizers said, "Can you please entertain the audience for 15 minutes or so while this other film finishes, and then we help the blind guy get down, to your film."
Yeah.
It took about 20 minutes. So I had to try to entertain the crowd and answer questions and everything without giving away what was in the film,
Right.
but keep them interested.
Right.
So so the response and some of the quotes, the emails that people have sent me, I've had some from Americans who happened to be in New Zealand and saw it.
Mm.
I showed it to people when I went on my next trip to Europe, I showed it to small groups of friends, and some of those responses were quite extraordinary too.
Thinking about your words from the very beginning when we started our conversation, you talked about that you had been interested in comics and war comics, and that the Germans had been the villains all the time, and which makes sense regarding the Second World War, First World War, and so on. But now it's kind of a totally different story, or page of history, if you like, when it comes to the two separated German states and the reunification, where you have been part of that very significant historical day. But I was just wondering, when you were airing your film, and about the reception, how Kiwis that came probably from the same background, only knew about Germany and Germans in terms of war and being the enemy and stuff. So the narration had changed quite a bit, and it's been a different story now after the reunification. So I was just wondering about how they received your film, because you are one of them and you went over and you experienced all that, and then you came back with your film telling them that story out of a, if you like, New Zealand viewpoint. So that interested me here, if that changed anything, or if they got the chance to see it through a different lens perhaps.
No, that is an interesting question. So to fill in the background a little bit more on that, just little details. Yes, the idea that the Germans and the Japanese were enemies and not to be touched with was still very strong, as I was growing up. My father, for example, refused to buy a Japanese car for years. When after 1989, Camilla from Regensburg came to New Zealand to visit me. My mother quietly took me aside at one point and said, "You do realize you need to be careful. If you're going to marry a German woman, there will be some negativity, and you have to be prepared for that." She was talking about from her generation, the older generation, of course. But I think by the time we made the film, and with jumbo jets making travel to the other side of the world so much easier and so on, and New Zealand being so attractive to German people particularly, it was used to be a joke that if you were staying in a youth hostel anywhere on the tourist trail around New Zealand, it was like visiting Germany, because 90% of the people in the hostel would be Germans. Um, and most Germans that I met around New Zealand at that time um, had no problem with any kind of prejudice of that kind. It was definitely something of my parents' generation. But I think by mine, despite that consciousness that I grew up with, um, it had been countered by tourism, by travel, by that kind of thing. And also, I think, our perception of Germany was evolving over time. The fact that the rest of the Western world had helped Germany get back on its feet again with the Marshall Plan and things like that. I came to the conclusion that part of the reason why the young German people I met were so welcoming and so friendly, both when I was traveling around Europe in 87 and 89 and later, and in Germany itself in the subsequent years. I'd have these amazing conversations. But the conclusion I came to was that friendliness was a result of the desire of young German people, particularly in that generation, to be forgiven for their history and to be accepted by the rest of the world. That's the conclusion I came to.
Yeah. And were you surprised how Germans kind of face their own history in a quite, straight and obvious way as well? So, no German would say no to a discussion about Hitler and the war and stuff. But I feel like often foreigners think they might be offending if they start a conversation about that. But Germans are actually quite good in facing that, bad history.
Oh, absolutely. And that created an immense respect for me, for the German people, that they were prepared to confront their history and deal with it and acknowledge it and were willing to talk about it. As I say, perhaps another time I'll tell you some of those stories because they're also quite extraordinary. And often those conversations were initiated by them, not by me. I didn't want to intrude by asking such questions, especially often with people I'd only just met. But they would start these conversations.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that conversation because it's so interesting to hear your point of view.
No, well, thank you very much for being interested.
Thank you for listening. This was an interview recorded by the curator of the Berlin Wall Stories exhibition, Alexandra Falk. We hope you enjoyed it. There are 9 more recorded interviews in this playlist. Maybe you want to explore them as well. Thank you and bis bald.